Thank you very much, Antonella, and welcome also very much from my side. I'm Karol Borowiecki and a professor of economics at the University of Southern Denmark. And within INCULTUM, I am much involved into anything related to data. And as such, I have the pleasure and duty to welcome you to this public part of the data workshop measuring the impact of cultural tourism. Data is a new gold, at least some argue this. Others argue that data is a new oil, oil that fuels the digital economy. There are also some who say that data is a new currency and recommend to not let it slip through your fingers. Now, independent whether data is shiny, whether it is black or green, it is an asset, and I think on this we all agree. It is something valuable, and it can make it can enable the making of better decisions. In cultural and creative industries, the value of data is increasingly recognized. This is what I at least feel and observe and experience. But the value of data is not always exploited. And sometimes this is not exploited because the know-how is missing. So what we have done today, we have prepared this workshop with two amazing keynote speakers to share some of the know-how related to data, related to culture and heritage. So two experts who are really specializing on these topics. Before I introduce them, let me just begin by saying here thank you especially to Sarah Mitchell, who has really driven the organization of this workshop. Sarah Mitchell is with me also at STU. And a big thank you to Valentina and Antonella from Promoter, who have supported us here as well, especially when it came to the communication. The talks by the two keynote speakers will be about 40 minutes long. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, preferably at the end of the talk, and then we will have a good time to take your questions. If you prefer instead, alternatively, you can type in the question also into the chat after the presentation. The first speaker, Trilce Navarrete, who is a lecturer at Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Previously, she was also a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam and postdoc at the University of Southern Denmark, a time that I recollect most warmly. She's an expert on the historic and economic aspects of digital heritage. The digital is really capitalized, it's really her focus and expertise, which also becomes quite clear in all her many publications of papers and chapters on the digital heritage at the Digital Museum, including a book, A History of Digitization, the case of Dutch museums. And most impressively, perhaps, she's a co-editor with Ruth Toes of the Handbook of Cultural Economics. And this is actually a major reference work in the field. So it's quite impressive. In her spare time, Trilce edits the Economist Talk Art blog, and she also paints. And now in her talk, she will paint us a picture of how cultural statistics evidence can provide societal and economic impact. Trilce, the floor is yours.
Hi, Karol. It's a pleasure to hear you. Great to be here. Thank you for the kind invitation. I guess I'll share my slides. Let's see. PowerPoint. And if everything goes well, let's see. Can you see the slides? Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you. So we will discuss today these cultural statistics to evidence societal and economic impact. I really want to thank the opportunity to, as usual, to share a little bit of the thoughts And this time I actually extended the invitation also to Jessica Juncker, one of our future cultural economics researchers at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. And so what we will say, if I understood correctly, we have 40 minutes and Zico and 40 minutes us. And so we will discuss quickly why should we go about measuring beyond this market economic value and get into other fuzzy things. Then we will discuss what are the impacts and present the theory of change. And then I'll share some of the tools that are my specialty is museums, and I'll share some of the tools for museums that I consider could be interesting also for the work that you are doing with tourism. So I'll better put my timing. Here we go. The slide. So, whoops, sorry about that. So why do we want to know what's impact? And actually, I'm quoting here one of our people in the audience, Kazuko Goto and also Trine Bille, have written about this sort of two perspectives. So when you consider the government that are wanting to support culture and they have to allocate these funds, there's generally two ways to communicate this support. So the first one, and it's gaining a lot of interest and popularity, is this economic reasoning, in which their goal is to measure this market economic value as it grows, and is perhaps focused on, what might be the contribution to the economy in terms of jobs, what might be the perceived externalities, in some very successful urban regeneration projects that could be, multiplier effect up to 5.5, which is rather high. There could be maybe this notion of, if we have, particularly with public art, if we invest in something that everybody has access to, why should anybody want to finance it if everybody can benefit for free? And then the last one is, when we are able to, let's say, exploit or get the benefits from the investment in culture, generally there's a lot of investment beforehand. Let's take the museum. You first need, a building to show, a collection that needs to be collected. You need the specialized staff. You need to do research. You need to develop the exhibit before you can open the doors and maybe start charging ticket sales and something else. And so this extreme high upfront cost might be something that, governments might want to sort of reduce these negative effects of the cost structure. The other argument is more towards the cultural policy. And this is, from a welfare perspective, we want to argue that when we invest in culture, we're actually supporting the socioeconomic side of our lives. There's a socioeconomic value. And why? Because arts and cultural heritage, furthers excellence, innovation, and access when they receive additional support. And we also know that when politicians and when the market supports arts, there's this recognition and celebration of the national, regional, or local identities. We know that culture and heritage are essential for defining identity in communities. And we also see that it is when there's an investment in culture that there can be a continuation for future generations to enjoy. And most of all, if we leave it only up to the market, we see this sort of tension in which only the most popular might be supported, whereas we know that having a very diverse cultural supply is essential for further stimulating creativity. And so these are sort of the two main reasons and ways of discussing the government support arguments. But then once government supports, how do they know they're doing it right or in the right direction, or they're getting really what they expect through all of their different modes of intervention? And so these are why impact studies have become quite popular nowadays. So the impact assessment, this is from a report from Floorman, it's about analyzing monitoring and managing the economic, the social, and the environmental consequences of intervention. So this is very much about looking at when governments intervene, there can be a positive or a negative a consequence. You know, tourism is a great example for that. Whenever there's a secret paradise and it gets discovered, then we can see sometimes over, you know, the negative effects of tourism. The consequences can also be intended or unintended. And on this note, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Jessica. She will just present a little bit on the types of impacts. Jessica.
Thank you, Trilce, for this nice introduction. So I'm here to explain a little bit more about what impact is exactly. So in order for organizations to measure their impact, impact first has to be defined. So impact in general can be seen as a change within society that can be created by the activity of an organization. This is a definition by the Erasmus Impact Center that has researched a lot of development. That has developed a lot of research on this topic. But the concept can be applied to more than one area. As for example, you have environmental impact, societal impact, social impact, well-being, or economic impact. And for this presentation, I will focus on economic, social, and societal impact. So what is economic impact? Economic impact really focuses on the quantifiable aspects of the outcomes and activities, such as the creation of jobs or improving gross domestic product. So really highlighting the financial and economic improvements of an organization. So one of the criticisms of this definition, or as on economic impact as a whole, is that organizations often really overestimate their economic impact. For example, cultural institutions or projects in an attempt to justify and satisfy their stakeholders. So for example, they can state that they have more indirect or induced effects on their environment, but it really isn't the case. So then we have social impact, and social impact definitions often focus on the community and the well-being of individuals and families. So this definition by Likert states that social impact is the value that is being created for a target audience or society as a whole, as a consequence of an undertaken activity of an organization. So she further develops this theory by adding often mentioned conditions to this impact. And those are like the effect is experienced by target audiences and stakeholders. And it also includes intended, unintended, positive, and even negative effects. And that is also a much known criticism. Many organizations only focus on the positive side and what is known to them. Therefore, it's really important that organizations incorporate their stakeholders to have different views and other possible impacts of their activities. And then the third condition is the effect is compared to what would have happened anyway. So what would have happened anyway? How is your organization contributing to these outcomes? And this is really about attribution versus contribution. So attribution is more that your activity directly leads to the impact, but you also have contribution, and that is like multiple organizations are contributing to the effect. And one criticism of social impact is the boundaries. How do you know all the impacts that you are making on your environment? So again, therefore, it's really important to involve your stakeholders so you get all the views and all the effects possible. So then we come to societal impact. And societal impact is a much broader concept that refers to the overall impact that, for example, art generates on society at large. So it includes economic, cultural, but also social dimensions. So within societal impact, there are generally two movements who both have their own vision on the definition of societal impact. So in the first movement, impact is seen as the highest level of the value chain, where impact can be seen as sustainable long-term changes. So within this definition, there's a distinction that can be made between mission impact and societal impact, where the former entails the impact linked to the mission of an organization, and the latter consists of all the impacts, no matter the mission of the organization. So this also includes the negative and the unintended effects of the activity. So, for example, when a charity focuses on eradicating a certain disease, it can also have a spillover effect of lowering health costs in the country. But their mission is solely focused on eliminating the disease, while their societal impact is also lowering health costs. So to get an overview of all the impacts and effects, unintended and intended, it's important for the organizations to also involve their stakeholders in the whole entire process. So by incorporating their different visions and ideas. Other movement that is seen within impact, within societal impact, is the focus on the other movement sees impact as all the changes that are brought about, except for the ones that would have happened anyway. So this definition differs from the other movements, as the focus really lies on the effects of the activities that are attributed to the activity and the project of the organization. So with this definition, it must be proven that the effect is caused by the activity and not by external factors. So what is the added value of an organization's output? So then we go to how to measure input and how to organize input. You can go to the next slide. Yes. So the Erasmus Impact Center has developed the impact path, consisting of 5 steps to measure the impact of an organization. So the first step is really defining the social mission and the impact goals of the organization by making this analysis. So by making the analysis of the mission and the goals, the organization has to look at potential problems they encounter and possible solutions for this problem. So when talking and engaging with different target groups and stakeholders, the organization can start with composing their impact goals and objectives. What does the organization want to accomplish? What do they want to reach? And to what extent? So an important aspect of composing impact goals is that they can always change and they need to be adjusted on the basis of further research or changing circumstances. So after establishing the goals and the organization needs to focus on how they want to establish these goals. So which effects occur as a result of the activities of the organization and what are the effects on the long term. So an often used tool to determine these factors is the theory of change. So according to Jackson, which is his researcher, a theory of change is the construction of a model that specifies, usually visually, the underlying logic, assumptions, influences, causal linkages, and expected outcomes of a development program or a project or an activity. So it is important to also involve the stakeholders in this step of the impact measurement. So what are the changes that they are experiencing and what changes do they hope to see in the long term? So practically the TOC, the theory of change, consists of the following aspects, namely the input, what resources does the organization use to execute their activity. So for example, what types of knowledge, capital is one of the inputs of an organization. Then the second one is the activities. So what kind of activities does the organization undertake to make their impact? And then the outputs are really quantifiable. So what are the direct results of the activity? So how many people have you reached or how many activities have you undertaken? And then you have the direct effects and the indirect effects. And the direct effects are what are the changes that follow from the output, and the indirect effects of how do the direct effects work through the indirect effects. So this is really long term. So after elaborating and validating the change model, it's important for an organization to keep track of their direct results and outputs. These entail the concrete and measurable results of an activity. So then in step 4, the organizations can measure their mission-related and other possible effects of your activity. It is important to gain insight in what activities realize the determined impact in order to increase or maximize that impact. So an organization can use this insight with stakeholders to substantiate what you have achieved, or for example, the funding that you get from various stakeholders, and to communicate also your social values. So one of the most important things to keep in mind that organizations cannot measure every effect established in the theory of change, and therefore have to really prioritize the most important ones. So after having established the effects, indicators must be formulated to assess how these effects can be measured. And this can be done by various sorts of research. So as for example, you could use interviews, questionnaires, or experiments to measure and to really research if you have made the impact that you really wanted to make.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Let's see if I can manage the slides. Jessica has mentioned the basics. I would like to show then some of the models on how to measure impact. This is again from this publication 2016, in which they have noted there's an explosion in these models from the late 1990s, particularly regarding the environmental impact, followed by social impact. But for today, I'd like to highlight a couple of the reports that have been published more specifically that I think might be relevant for you. A Dutch report, the Learning Museum report measuring impacts, the UK Arts Council, Creative Spillovers in Europe, and the European project MAPSI, Managing Art Projects with Societal Impact. The LAM, the Learning Museum, proposes actually this very simple overview in how, following up with what Jessica was saying on inputs and outputs, you have a notion on considering your inputs, funding, staff, and human resources, and then your museum with all its characteristics, its specific mission, its specific collection, its audience. Then you have to consider these values. And the notion of values goes back to the first slide, in which, when we consider why must we do this, is generally because there's some values behind, experience value, economic value, as well as cultural value, collection value, and so on. And then they propose that the institutions look at their specific outputs, and here you notice that it gets a little bit more personalized, and as each museum might have their own exhibitions, their own websites, their own educational activities, maybe a shop. And then at the end, you try to figure out the impacts. And so it's very much based on the inputs, the values that you have, what are activities you do, what sort of impacts you might be able to identify. And then the other report on MAPSI, what they, and I thought this was an interesting overview for you perhaps, what they propose is there's not really one model that fits all, and you might want to do a combination of some of these tools. So the first one is a matrix, just sort of looking at this outcome impact. Another one is the outcome mapping, looking at the behavioral changes. The balance scorecard is also quite popular with museums now. The gap analysis, looking at where are you now and where would you like to be in the future, what do you need to get there. Benchmarking to see, evaluate yourself based on what your peers are doing. Performance prism in terms of understanding you have so many stakeholders, but you might only want to capture a few, that you prioritize which ones you like to look at first. And the social return of investment model, in which you try to quantify in financial measure the social benefits you might support. And going back to the LAM, what they again stress is very much working with your stakeholders so that you can develop these frameworks and models, trying to eventually get to what is it that we want to know. So you first start with who are we, what are we trying to reach, and then what data might we have available, and what does that data mean. Yeah, how to collect data. Oh yeah, that's the next slide. In terms of the economic impact, Jessica has mentioned something, so there could be looking at the contribution of the institution or the site to the economy in the form of having increased employment, but there's also the other side, so perhaps they're also supporting on paid labor, and this multiplier effect on income and sales, but there might be also waste. And there's the attraction of tourists and investment, but that might lead to increasing the cost of living. There might be wonderful place branding, but might also just support the few superstars and take away a lot of the attention for the smaller sites. And might influence real estate markets and urban generation, but might lead to gentrification effect. And this economic impulse might value, might capture the value deriving from the existence of the cultural services in general. In terms of the societal impact, there's also quite menu of ingredients to choose from. The MAPSI proposes social cohesion, and I put this slide, it's extremely slow, but you'll get the copy so you can take a look at it at home later on. Social cohesion, innovation and creativity, education and audience development, well-being and health, sustainability, economic influences, political influences, communication and interaction. And here is what Jessica was mentioning, that there's this tendency now to not separate social and economic, but bring them together within the societal. Key to this is to have a differentiation between the short-term effects that one institution or activities might have versus the long-term strategic effects. Sorry? Oh, I think this was a mic was on. Okay. Please, if there's a question, feel free to interrupt me. There's a differentiation that can be done in terms of the individual impacts, so the societal impacts, and this is one schema to do that with some of the proposed reports where you can maybe look at more. But I think that in general, cultural sites go more for this approach on the generic social outcomes. This is from the UK, in which it divides it in 3 main pillars. So the on the one side is the stronger and safe communities, you know, having access to cultural participation strengthens public life, as well as health and well-being. These are things that generally we start to question to what extent we can actually measure these. For museums, and I would say generally also for heritage sites, one of the trickiest things that we have tried to delve with in the past years is this notion of the role of museum as a learning institution. People go to museums and they learn, not directly, sometimes almost by osmosis or accident, but nonetheless, there's very much the learning part of the institution as key role in society. And so this, again, an UK model is trying to identify 5 ways in which individuals might learn. And these are the 5 generic learning outcomes. So in school, we're also, you know, the university, we're also trying to figure out how to test our students. And the approach in museums and heritage institutions is not really to say, you know, did you learn the lesson, but actually to see, you know, to what extent this visit perhaps supports notions of empathy, notions of creativity, notions of social skills, and perhaps you know, a change in behavior. This is what everybody would like to eventually lead to. Let's see if my slides are slow. I want to just make a note to Mataroso's list of social impacts of 50, and these are from 1997, and I think, again, I think in the 90s, there was quite an interesting discussion going on what, you know, perhaps also brought by the digital, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And so you see a lot of these very interesting proposals. 50 might be too overwhelming, so I'll summarize just to say that they're about personal development, social cohesion, community empowerment, local image and identity, imagination and vision, and health and well-being. I mean, this is at the core of what most models are trying to propose. This is from the LEM report, just to show that the way to define the questions can be quite tricky. But I would suggest that you don't define new questions, but take a look at all of the reports that already exist, because that will also help to compare data results, but also because the frameworks are already there. Last, I'd like to share this paper by, some of you might know, Pierluigi Sacco and colleagues. What they argue is that really this participation is clearly full of value beyond just the ticket sales or maybe even learning. And you see that there's a change in potential change in individuals and in their communities, and they list these effects. So there's innovation, cultural welfare, sustainability, social cohesion, new entrepreneurship models, lifelong learning, soft power, and local identity. I want to highlight just two. So sustainability, they propose that when you participate on culture, you foster social mobilization, awareness about social consequences of individual behaviors related to the environment. And so, and for sure, tourism is key on this. And how do you balance being, a touristic site while still, sharing all this goodness, while still respecting the environment? And what they propose is, well, look at cultural participation through, they did this study in which they differentiated the waste and the recycling of the participants. Another one is the role of soft power, and this I had to highlight given the current political situation in East Europe, in which culture actually has quite a strong role in terms of increasing visibility, to improve reputation, to influence relations, regional, national, and international, and of course having this political, economic, and social dimension. We see it now with what's going on with Ukraine. What they propose is that you could operationalize this through amateur classes, to educational services, or through cultural and creative production. But I think tourism is very much also an important let's say benefit. When you invite international guests, you obviously have heritage in some part of the program. As a summary, just to say that measuring impacts could have different approaches on the economic impact. As we have said, you can focus on the visitor of the museum spending. That's generally the case. Another approach is the contingent valuation, but I think in this case it might be more relevant to go on and looking at what is the contribution of these sites for the local economy. And the main risk is, as Jessica's mentioned, defining these boundaries, and it might actually be more suitable for the superstars. Sources of data are secondary sources of surveys. On social impact, this focuses more on the outcome. The main approaches are general social outcomes, or the general learning outcomes, understanding that heritage is really a different product or service in the market because of this. So generally it's the learning or the identity clause. The risk is defining this desired social effect, understanding this individual subjective valuation might play a role in the results, and trying to capture this multi-value complexity. And the others are the hybrid social return of investment, in which you might be able to capture both the social and a little bit quantify this. The risk is finding the right proxies, lack of comparable data if you're really looking at what the one institution is aiming to achieve based on their mission. But nonetheless, it's a promising method. And the last, the spillover effects, is how you're trying to find these unintended and casual relationships. The risk is, as we all good know, establishing these casual relationships. As Carol mentioned, my area of work for the last many years has been the digital, and I would like to share just three graphs from this report that has just been published by the Dutch. It was commissioned by the Dutch Ministry of Culture. They want to know what happened during COVID. What's going on with our digital heritage? What is that? The challenge with this is, what kind of data do you want to gather? So when we look at museums or even heritage sites, you look at people traveling to the site, entering. You might also capture, expenditure there or some other things. But in digital, particularly with heritage, that business model is not there. So we might have some data, some stats, web statistics, or some institutions are trying to charge for some services, but it's quite tricky. And most importantly, what it will be that digital service? How do you draw there? You know, how do you draw the boundary? So when will a museum doing digital activities stops being the museum being digital and starts being, you know, a third party or just a visitor, you know, doing their thing. And so these notions of definition are actually quite crucial. Nonetheless, this report I find quite interesting because of three things. One, they are able to note, to document that there's a change going on. When we participate in heritage, there's some sense of active participation, but in digital, the new generations, and thank God our technology is improving, is increasingly active. And so what needs to be captured is definitely these activities that the participants are involved in. And one might that be, in this graph you see, based on the age groups, there are about less than 1,000 respondents. You see that the youngsters 16 to 24 are noticeably more active online. What is that? That you upload photos, that you upload content, but also that you download content and you make your own thing to re-upload again. And so it's a very different notion. You know, when you're starting to say, what is the site, what do we manage, and what does the other manage, so the public, you get quite interesting questions when you acknowledge this co-creation layer. Another point that I want to highlight is, and I'm sorry, these are in Dutch, the slides for that's creative, trying to get the notion of what it says. It's all online. You can translate with Google Docs. In this graph, what they're trying to show is that there is interest in content about heritage, but they don't ask it in the way Eurostat has been asking it, like, do you visit a museum online? This is for one kind of purpose, but we know that museums and heritage sites publish their content online for other reasons. And so this is trying to capture the reasons why will people consume or participate with heritage online. And on the top, you see 57% of respondents say they are interested in this kind of information. So it's very much about information consumption, not heritage consumption. And this is a key element in you know, remote digital participants. Second, 53% of participants said that they want to develop their knowledge. Therefore, they go into these places. 38% of population say they find this information easy to find, therefore, you know, they get to it. 30% say it's relaxing. And here we see again this multi-output of heritage. So it's not only that, you know, you pay a ticket to see something and then you go home, but it can be part of learning, part of information, part of you know, your enjoyment. And that's what makes it a little bit different. But this notion that consumption is different for other reasons is what intrigued me. And the last one is, what do we get out of it? So in the digital mode, you know, it's about 1,300 respondents that said, you know, 30 of them get nothing out of this digital heritage. They just don't get it. However, 30% do get something. What do they get? On the top, you see pleasure, enjoyment. Second, I'm interested in culture. And third is I'm interested in the Dutch history because it's in Dutch participants. And then it goes on, it supports my personal development, and it supports my understanding my family, understanding other families, and understanding culture, other cultures in general. And 8%, so these are the actives, it helps me, inspires me, and gives me the tools to further create. So again, this is capturing that participation is changing. And so when we go back to looking at, what's the economic impact, this has not been fully captured, but there's actually a co-creation, and there's a second or a post-creation that might later lead to economic income. And then in terms of the social impact, we see that we might have to rethink our questions when we're looking digital. And my phone is ringing, saying it's 40 minutes, 44 past 12. And so I just want to close by saying that we clearly see that heritage has an important role in society in terms of the social and economic contributions. Through all of these reports, and even just looking at this last little bit on digital, we see that the benefits are multiple. And in order to capture this, we also require these pluralistic tools that help us capture these. And the last point, really, this digital variant might bring another challenge. I didn't get into all the data because I think Enrico will get into this, showing on how we can scrap everything. And then what do you know? This is another really important question. We might only see a partial view, but nonetheless, it's a more wider view on how individuals are using our content online. So thank you very much. This is what we wanted to share. I'll stop sharing my slides, and I would like to have it open for questions.
Thank you very much, Trilce. This was really very insightful and impactful, I would say as well. Any questions or comments? As we wait for questions, perhaps let me kick off here, Trilce. So how can we differentiate between impact, where really value is created, value is added, versus an impact where value is simply relocated, right? So think about, just like one example here of an, direct economic impact. A tourist buys a ticket at an art museum. If this art museum didn't exist, she would buy a ticket at the existing history museum, for example, right? So I wonder what are the best practices to deal with this, right? Or to control for the situations where simply something is relocated, and at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important point, and actually something beyond that, beyond this, that might be also a challenge is to try to measure the captured value. And so when you say, we generate value, and maybe this value can be repositioned somewhere else. So heritage and heritage institutions are very good at generating value. And I agree with you that this methodological question on how to see if we're not if we're understanding that how can we mitigate this notion that the value might be moving around. I think what's most interesting right now for me is how to capture the capturing of value. And so, and again, going on the notion that when we buy a ticket, this might be the simplest way of participation. However, there's other forms of participation that have been perhaps neglected because of the lack of data. We have ticket sales, but we don't have other. And we see, for instance, in the Netherlands, membership schemes are flourishing. Why? Because when you buy a ticket, what's the service? You have unlimited time to be there. That's the service. However, membership, what's the service? It's a relationship. And this relationship, you can divide it, expand it more, let's say, easier than your whole services. So you have only one museum and one exhibition. So you can only sell so many kinds of tickets. For relations, you can expand in many ways you want. So what are the VIP perks? You can play with all of these types of membership schemes as well as with what will people do for you. And so we see this is much more developed in the US, for instance, in which members of the museum, friends of the museum, they might contribute with not only pitching in resources for a new acquisition, but they might actually contribute to deciding the decision making on what pictures, what objects might be acquired. And I think in the tourism example, memberships are not so developed. Heritage sites are, you know, it's generally the site that you go and you're there. But what could be the membership? This is the Spotify, right? With Spotify, it's a sort of membership model in that you have these two parties. You have, you know, the heritage sites on the one and the participants on the other, and you're supporting this meeting together. So I think I will actually go more on these type of challenges, try to find ways in which people will contribute to giving towards the heritage side and documenting this to show that every researcher that does an investigation on this is providing a specialist labor that otherwise you would not have. Beyond ticket entrances, this is all of these European projects, so much tax money going into, you know, like this wonderful project that you're involved now, is no heritage organization will be able to pay that. The benefits of this are tremendous. But again, that's trying to capture the value of these collaborations. And this, yeah, I guess there will be a different kind of business models that I think it could be beyond the just ticket sale. Maybe I just went a little bit on that tangent, sorry.
No, this is all very, very exciting, and I think we are good time-wise. We have certainly time for some questions. So Chiris, yes.
Yes, it was a very nice presentation, and it's very interesting about the business models in culture and tourism, and it's very interesting, and it's okay when it comes to museums and tickets. Maybe it's almost easy, but when it comes to local societies and people who are involved in local culture, how do they get the income from the culture that they produce? So that's also, because we're involved in INCULTUM, that's also our project in the area. How do the local association, cultural associations, and local people who are involved in cultural production in the area, how do they get the money from the income, the touristic activity?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the problem with the big superstar and the big institutions, sometimes they come in, bring the money, pay for the infrastructure, they take all of the income generated by tourists. That's very much a problem. I think that one of the, if I might say, one of the projects that we're just starting is trying to find innovative business models for heritage, and we see that one format is, you know, if you still want to work with the big firms like Ericsson and so, trying to capture this corporate social responsibility, in which the institutions or the large firms contribute financially, sort of to support some of the local, you know, there's mixed feelings on that. I think a more bottom-up approach will be actually building coalitions, and this we see post-corona. Large international tourism is not going to pick up soon. People are starting to be aware about other worries, including the environment and so on, and so we do see a definite change in behavior. In the Netherlands, it's curious how luxury spending has increased. So there's a lot of more art being sold. But in terms of the, as you say, the local traditions, the local artists, what's going on? We want to stimulate the collaboration with more established sites like museums, and to try to reuse this infrastructure already of having a museum shop, having some of the visitors come and having the branding, so that through that sort of local ecosystem, you can sort of support all of the areas that will generate these cultural activities. And so, in a heritage site, I can imagine that, I mean, that you don't only go to the site, but that you collaborate in producing some of the goods and services that can enrich the visitors' experience, not only in the site, but in the whole area. And trying to understand that, when a tourist visits, the visit is not only paying to get in the site, but it includes the flight, the hotel, the walking, all of the infrastructure, all of the previous, during the visit, of course, but also post-visit. And in terms of, conceptualizing this visit as pre, during, and post, then you see that the collaboration with your stakeholders has a lot more potential, because then you can collaborate in enriching this visit pre and post, where the hotels will be contributing, as well as the restaurant in the evening or whatever. And this has actually been quite developed in museums in terms of the generally from the learning perspective, in how you can improve the learning experience throughout this. Also considering a more long-term relationship with your visitors, and not only paying the ticket, and trying to develop a relationship with your local tourist is a second something that we see that is emerging from the corona, because again, when in terms of stress, you see that you have to work with those that can fly, or those that are interested, or those that know about you, and generally these are also the local communities. And so local tourism has been underestimated and actually neglected, and sort of it's only the big tourists that are supported. But we see that in order for heritage to be sustainable, you must have this comprehensive approach that includes your local producers and your local consumers.
Thank you so much.
I'm actually quite interested in your results. We hope to build from your results as well.
I think we are all interested in our results. Any final comments, remarks? Antonella, last shot.
Hi, teacher. Nice to meet you. Thank you for your interesting speech. I'm wondering if, in addition to tourists and local stakeholders, there is a third subject in the equation, that are the people living on the territory. So how this idea of the memberships and the relations can develop with regard to the people who live on the territory where we are looking for developing new forms of tourism. Have you any consideration to share with us on this?
Thank you, Antonella. Yes, I think the proper name for this is participatory governance. Individuals that are part of the tourism, I think, are as owners as the government officials or the individuals caring for the heritage institutions, because it's their it's their heritage. And so the model on participatory governance, I believe, is challenging, because experts tend to want to make all decisions themselves. But it's true that when you open the discussion, we see certainly with the environment, local communities and traditional knowledge are there for a reason so many years, because they have been able to survive for so long, and they might have other clues that younger approaches or younger interventions might miss. And so I think the approach to go with membership is exactly I don't like the word membership, because then you think of, okay, I pay and then I get something. But it's like a sports club, right? So you can pay and never go. Or you can pay and go, and that's just you know, you do the workout yourself, right? It's the same with culture. If you can pay like, you know, whatever, 5 euros, 100 euros, 25,000 a year, or you can contribute in another way. But it's this relationship that needs to be well established and more developed in that you are, as the Heritage side, is acknowledging this relationship, a member, or I will call them differently, as well as that the member understands, okay, what do I do and what are my benefits? And so for the Friends of the Museum, it's really clear that they contribute financially, and then they contribute with certain ideas, or, you know, the decisions are repurpose these membership fees. But when there's not this model of membership fees, the contributions can be differently. And here's again what I was mentioning, you know, sometimes if your local neighbors are at the university, you know, if you partner with them, you have incredible research that later on can, you know, catapult your collections to unknown horizons. And the same with all of your local population. In museums, there's the new notion now on and I'm sorry that all my examples are more about museums, this is my area of work. And there's this notion of the inclusive documentation. So we know that we have all these objects, we have this database, and entering all of these objects into the database is purely manual work. It takes decades. We've been going on it at 60 years at least, and we're not even halfway. And so we don't have enough experts and enough staff to do this, right? Why not invite the public? And so there's several projects in which they set up this system in which people who know these objects and are living with them contribute, for instance, the more storytelling part, or the more, you know, within this framework, they contribute the content that might still help the heritage institutions have a better notion of their collections and to be able to manage them. So I could imagine that such membership could be also developed in terms of knowledge, or in terms of other contributions to the heritage sites. And we know that heritage sites live because of their stories, right? Heritage sites is not only a stone, it's a stone that represents what was there, or that represents the people that were there. And so is the other parts that are quite valuable as well, and that can be kept alive through these communities.
Thank you very, very much, Trilce, for all these great responses. It gives us a lot of to think about. Thank you also for, well, I would say a guest appearance by Jessica Jonker. Thank you for joining the presentation.